We're back with testing for Ryzen 7000 CPUs. This time it's Eco Mode. We're going to be looking at the 7950X at 65 watts, or at least 65 watt as it's defined in Eco Mode, 105 watts, and then 170 watts also in Eco Mode. And really what we're looking at here is if you take a preset group of values and apply them to the AMD 7950X to bring down the effective power consumption, how much does that impact the performance for the trade-off that you're making? Because it feels a little bit bad if you spend $700, you buy a part, and then you go into BIOS and you intentionally limit the performance. But with how much power the 7950X consumes at over 250 plus watts, and with the middling efficiency at best, this might actually make some sense. And you've probably seen some discussion around it already, but we're just now going back through all the follow-ups that we've survived the onslaught of reviews following the 7000 series with Intel and then NVIDIA and also more Intel. So time to look at Eco Mode and see how it stacks up. Before that, this video is brought to you by Montech's SkyOne Lite PC case. The SkyOne Lite is Montech's high airflow case with ventilated front panel, included fans, and RGB LED accents. The SkyOne Lite is a compact mid-tower case for ATX builds, and the ARGB LED Quick Connect on the front panel makes it easy to maintain the case without all of the cables. Dust filters are strategically placed, and there's basic cable management features while still maintaining a competitive price. Learn more at the link in the description below. So this is mostly something there's two things you can look at here. There's thermal and there's power, and then there's sort of a tertiary one of power efficiency. And with thermal and power, if you are for some reason concerned about the relatively high numbers you'll see for T-die of 95 degrees Celsius for 7950X, because that's what it boosts to, then this would bring that number down, because you are going to be power capping the CPU rather than thermal capping it in most conditions. Now the same is true for just power consumption in general, or efficiency, where capping the performance will give you probably an efficiency boost. Now part of that is because anytime you take parts, especially that are flagship, and you drop off a little bit of the top end for performance, you constrain them by power, even by say 10%, normally the efficiency swing there is massive, because what the companies do is they push as much through as they can in most cases to try and get the last percentage point on the chart, just in case their competitor bumps them out of slot 1 and into slot 2 for 1 or 2% performance swing in the chart. So it's a competitive thing. It's always a debate of, do we want to run this thing the optimal efficiency out of the box, or do we want to try and make sure we're first place? And AMD went for first place, and they absolutely blew it all in the power budget as a result. Now, Ryzen's Eco Mode is technically not new. It was actually sort of introduced back with Zen 2, or the 3000 series. We just didn't really cover it back then. It wasn't as necessary. Those were fairly low power CPUs in general. So now with Zen 4, Eco Mode is more closely tied with PBO, or Precision Boost Overdrive. PBO is off by default, or it's supposed to be, and if it's not, you need to rat out the motherboard vendor who's leaving it on. So it's off by default. That is not the same as Precision Boost 2. Precision Boost 2 is part of the normal boosting behavior of Ryzen CPUs. PB2 is the name for how they boost under stock out-of-the-box conditions. PBO, or Overdrive, is the one where you start changing how they behave stock. But Eco Mode is tied to PBO, even though it's kind of going in the more efficient, less power direction, rather than just blasting the clocks. And the reason is because for Eco Mode, it's really just presets or groups of numbers that are defined by AMD for power and current limits that are adjusted within PBO typically. And some of them happen to be below stock, hence Eco. The things that you're manipulating with Eco Mode are specifically PPT, TDC, and EDC, and we'll cover AMD's definitions for each of these. So PPT is the package power tracking value. This is the allowed socket power consumption permitted across the voltage rails supplying the socket. Applications with high thread counts or heavy threads can encounter PPT limits that can be alleviated with a raised PPT limit. TDC, or thermal design current, is the maximum current, in amps of course, that can be delivered by a specific motherboard's voltage regulator configuration in a thermally constrained scenario. And then EDC, or the electrical design current, is the maximum current in amps that can be delivered by a specific motherboard's voltage regulator in a peak or a spike condition for a short period of time. Now, we actually originally covered some of this stuff when we did our Precision Boost Overdrive piece, which you should definitely watch because that technology hasn't changed from whenever we covered it till now. It's the same idea, and it gives you a lot of really good base knowledge of how Ryzen works if you're interested in learning how the CPUs actually work. So these variables, they come together to form Zen 4's CTDP, or Configurable Thermal Design Power. We've made a simple table of these values across the stock TDPs to try and help out here. There's 3 of them mainly to look at. PBT has stayed the same between AM5 and AM4 for the 65 watt and the 105 watt TDPs, but both TDC and EDC are higher. 170 watt mode is new for AM5 with higher limits across the board. These higher limits are part of the reason AMD redesigned the socket. AMD wanted more power to be available for Zen 4 and whatever's after it. I don't know why I said it that way. Probably 5. Normally after 4. Maybe there's going to be a plus. For the 170 watt 7950X and 7900X, the stock limits are the same as the 170 watt Eco Mode, and the 105 watt 7700X and 7600X stock limits are the same as the 105 watt Eco Mode numbers. That means Eco Mode's at the same TDP as stock for a given CPU should give identical performance per AMD's guidance. And one thing we want to make clear again is that TDP does not equal actual power consumed. It's the same for Intel. Intel for a while was actually pretty close. They're kind of way off every now and then, depends on how Tau is working. But anyway, for AMD, TDP is not the same as power consumption necessarily. They try to get it close, but in this case, it's not even in line with AMD's own PPT. TDP for AMD is based on this formula. And one of the variables, theta Ca, or thermal resistance of the cooler, is defined by AMD. The other ones are also actually defined by, it's all defined by AMD. And none of these are power, except for the one that this equals when you're done calculating it. So AMD did this originally so that it could tweak the TDP numbers to closely match Intel's. And this was so it could get OEM system builders on board with its new Zen architecture. This was back in the day. So they designed the formula to reverse engineer the number that they wanted it to be. Think about that for a second. The problem was we need our number to equal the incumbent's number, Intel, who's in all the OEM builds because Bulldozer was a dumpster fire and later got them sued. So we need these 2 numbers to be the same. How do we do that? Create a formula where we can put stuff in and get that. And that's what they did. And it's kind of, at this point, that's how they're all done. And if you're interested in the video and learning about why they did it this way and what it means for you, you can click on that link somewhere up here or in the description. That means the TDP value changes depending on what cooler is being used to calculate it by AMD. For AM5 CPUs, AMD also told us that thermal resistance in the formula is different this time than from the AM4 CPUs. That means TDP numbers are no longer directly comparable. 65 watts in AM4 is not 65 watts in AM5. So just your regular important reminder, TDP has no bearing really on actual power consumption. They try to get it close, but it's because they put numbers in to try and make it equal it. Okay, so enough of all the setup. Let's get into some numbers. We'll start with all core power consumption, which is where it'll be the most noticeable. We'll kick off the charts with power consumption in Blender. Test out the EPS 12 volt cables. Stock power with the new BIOS is 263 watts, placing it near the very bottom of our chart, but still ahead of the 13900K. It's pulling 66% more power than 105 watt Eco Mode as well, which has the 7950X at a massively reduced 158 watts. That 158 is 16 watts more than the PPT limit dictates for 105 watt mode, and it's not anywhere close to 105 watts because of reasons we told you earlier, but this has the 7950X effectively tied with the 13600K. That's an impressive reduction and will have implications for the efficiency section in a big way. 65 watt Eco Mode comes in at even lower power at 89 watts draw, which is in line with the PPT limit of 88 watts, and then it's 174 watts lower than stock. So it's pretty crazy to see the 16 core part putting up such a wide range of power consumption numbers, but that'll have an impact on performance, and we'll look at that in a moment, especially with the frequency change. Next is our single core power chart, measured in the same way as the all-core test and performed using Cinebench. The 7950X at stock measured at 55 watts at the EPS 12 volt cables, barely lower than the infamous FX9590 and tying 65 watt Eco Mode exactly. 105 watts was technically slightly lower than that, but we consider this within variance for this particular test. 105 watt mode pulled 7% more than the 7900X and 52% more than the 7700X. But again, even with the power restrictions of 105 watt and 65 watt modes, single core workloads simply don't push the 7950X enough to run into the power limits. Our frequency bar chart represents the average frequency in megahertz across all cores during our in-house GN Logo Blender render after reaching steady state. Stock baseline for our 7950X is 5,103 megahertz average, which is 306 megahertz faster than the 105 watt mode. But remember, this is an all-core workload, so that's 306 megahertz averaged as an increase across all 16 cores. That is a huge increase. It takes a ton of power to get that extra 300 megahertz though when you're already near the limit of stability. 65 watt mode has the R9 running more than 1,000 megahertz below stock. It's really falling off here due to those power constraints, and at this stage, you're going to kill some performance to the extent that maybe it's better to buy something else instead of dropping to 65 watts. A better power supply would be a good consideration here. This will result in less performance at 65 watt Eco Mode, but we'll need to see how it shapes up in the benchmarks. Next, we have the frequency plot over time, just to illustrate the stability of the average clocks in each mode. The stock line plots a nearly flat frequency for the entirety of this test. There's some fluctuation and initial drop-off as load ramps, but overall it's flat. The plot for 105 watt mode is less stable than stock, exhibiting how the boosting behavior finds opportunistically the highest valid clock at any moment given the lower power headroom. The highest spikes get within a few megahertz of the baseline, so that's a sign that less heavily threaded or burstier workloads should have 105 watt mode near stock performance. 65 watt mode shows less consistency and a wider deviation from the mean than 105 watt mode and at a lower average frequency. This will give less mathematically predictable all-core performance in timed tests. CPU thermals are next. For this, we're still using our Arctic Liquid Freezer 2 360. We run 100% fan speeds for all tests because the point of these reviews is to have everything be controlled and to unconstrain the CPUs as much as we can because it's a CPU benchmark. So for this, we have controls for that. We're also running an ambient temperature of 21 degrees Celsius, and this is important because as background information, temperature is not like a Cinebench score. We've seen plenty of discussion online where people are like, the 7600X runs at 60 degrees Celsius. That's not how it works. The CPU runs at a temperature depending on all of the other factors contributing to the CPU's performance. So the cooler is one of the big ones. And this seems basic, but it is a common misconception. The one interesting difference this generation, as a reminder, is that Zen 4 with like a 7950X, for example, will boost especially to hit a thermal limit, a thermal ceiling of 95 degrees Celsius. So changing the cooler will change the frequency rather than the temperature under stock conditions with normal cooling. So that's something to be aware of if you're not already. Just like in our original review, stock settings have the 7950X hitting a wall around 95 degrees Celsius, as that's the standard thermal limit for Zen 4. Things get interesting with 105 watt Eco Mode, where 95C is out the window and the 7950X runs at only 62 degrees Celsius or 34 degrees lower than stock. That's an enormous difference given the relatively small gap in average frequency, but again, that's a gap against all cores. So that's the 300 megahertz, it really adds up. These huge drops are because the CPU's limit is being shifted from thermals to power. And it shows another angle of just how much AMD lets the 7950X run past the point of efficiency just to squeeze out every drop of performance. It'd be similar to running an older like 5600X or something in terms of power target, or at least, well, sort of TDP anyway. Our next chart is for performance per watt efficiency, and what we're looking at here is watt hours. So we have a fixed unit of work, which is rendering one frame. We have a time that's dependent on the performance of the CPU, and then we know the power consumption at any given point during the test, so we can calculate its efficiency, or how much energy does it really require to get that unit of work done. The 7950X at stock ranks at 26.4 watt hours and tied with the stock 7900X. 105 watt Eco Mode is a lot better at an impressive 36% more efficient than stock, and 65 watt mode posts a 30% improvement on top of that. So that takes the top spot in our chart now. And like we said earlier, you'll be giving up some all-core performance to do that, so it becomes questionable whether it's actually a good purchase if you run it that constrained. Both Eco Modes on the 7950X mark an improvement over the 5950X, which was our previous efficiency champion at 19 watt hours. The other Zen 4 CPUs fall short of these marks. It's possible they would place higher here if running in their own Eco Modes, but we had to draw the line somewhere with testing. Feel free to try them out yourself though if you're using one of the other CPUs. The 13900K at stock is far outclassed by the 7950X for efficiency in either Eco Mode option, with the 105 watt mode at 48% more efficient. Intel is blasting power at stock for the 13900K to compete in all-core workloads, and so is AMD. We'll check out the absolute performance soon. Ultimately, if all-core load efficiency is something you care a lot about, you'd be well served by the 7950X and 105 watt Eco Mode. 65 watts for pure efficiency, sure. That said, the speed at which the work gets done matters a lot too, so let's get into that. Our first production test is Blender, where we measure the time it takes to complete an in-house GN logo render, and results are in minutes, with lower being better. We're presenting a truncated chart for this, so for more CPUs, check out our 13600K review, where you'll get everything. The 7950X at stock completed the render in 6 minutes, and that's 6% less time required than the 105 watt 7950X, matching the earlier average frequency results. That's impressive when considering the earlier mentioned 100 plus watt savings. So far, things look good for 105 watt Eco Mode. If this is the kind of work you do to make money, it would be seriously worth calculating the difference between the time savings of stock and the power savings of 105 watt mode. Realistically though, the power cost won't matter a lot for people unless you're running renders actually non-stop, all-core, maybe even on multiple machines depending on power cost where you live. 65 watt mode finished in 8 minutes, and it was beaten by 105 watt mode by 20% time reduced, tying the 12-core 7900X at stock. Interesting in its own way, but it falls short of the 13900K. Losing 20% to the 105 watt mode is kind of a lot here, so we wouldn't recommend 65 watt mode for work like this for most users. You're in territory where it's probably better to just buy something else instead. Next is a Chromium code compile test in Windows, again measured in minutes. The 7950X at stock finished the test in 38 minutes, only being topped by the less expensive 13900K at 6% time reduced. 105 watt Eco Mode makes another strong showing, functionally tying stock for much less power and at lower temperatures. 65 watt mode finishes 6% faster than the 7900X and only permits a 13% lead for the stock result. But remember that the 7900X is $550. So if you're actually thinking of running 65 watts, it may be better to just save that money for something else in your build, like say the 7900X plus a $150 more expensive power supply that'll last you a decade and get you similar long-term efficiency gains and be usable in other systems in the future. Moving on to file compression testing, we use 7-Zip's built-in benchmark where the score is measured in millions of instructions per second, or MIPS. 105 watt Eco Mode on the 7950X scored within 1% of stock and outperformed 65 watt mode by 9%. There's not much downside to using the 105 watt mode here, but a 10% hit for 65 watts is chopping a lot of performance off of an expensive part. That's basically $70 worth of your purchase. Since scaling between stock and 105 watt mode is so tight, comparisons to the other CPUs on the chart are not really noticeable in differences other than inherent differences in power. The 7900X is outperformed by the 7950 by 17% in 105 watt mode and 8% in 65 watt mode. And again, $150 cheaper upfront cost for the 7900X. The 7900X might just be a better choice between them if you're using this mode. Switching to decompression, the 7950X at stock now has a 5% advantage over 105 watt mode, which itself leads 65 watt mode by 20%, another one of the massive gaps here. We usually see a wider gap between parts in decompression than compression, so far this is expected behavior. We also see Zen's specific advantage here in comparison to a 13900K, where the 7950X in 105 watt mode tied the i9 in compression, but it now overtakes it by 14% in decompression, so a big switch up there. 65 watt Eco Mode is 5% ahead of the 7900X, and it cleanly doubles the stock 7600X, which is an absolutely irrelevant comparison other than it's kind of interesting to look at. We'll finish off our production test with the Adobe suite, starting with Photoshop. We We use Puget Bench to run through a set of functions and calculate an aggregate score. 105 watt Eco Mode ties stock performance here, and 65 watt mode only gives up a 5% lead. In this instance, that's pretty good for lower power targets compared to the out-of-the-box thermals. In fact, performance across all CPUs tested is pretty similar, although the 13900K stands out with a 7% advantage over the 7950X's 105 watt Eco Mode result. If Photoshop is a big use case for your PC, you have a lot of high performance options right now, and it's up to you to pick your priority between absolute performance with a 139K, price efficiency with a 13600K, or power efficiency with a 7950X and Eco Mode. Finally, we have Premiere, benched in a similar way to Photoshop and scored in aggregate. The 7950X in stock outperforms 105 watt Eco Mode by a very narrow margin, which itself leads the 7900X by 6% and ties with the 13900K. This really nails down that 105 watt mode gives up next to nothing in production performance most of the time compared to stock settings. The gap is a little wider with 65 watt Eco Mode, where stock scored 10% better. Still not bad given the massive power difference and thermal difference, but as Premiere users ourselves, we wouldn't readily want to give up 10%. That performance is just worth way more to us to get our jobs done quickly, and 10% could be the difference of it scrubbing painfully and not. We're gonna get into gaming charts now, but the 7950X, we didn't recommend it for gaming in our review as just like that's the thing you're doing with it. It's really for production work, and the gaming, it's nice that it can do it, but you should buy something else if that's all you're doing. So that's not gonna change here. Our conclusion will be the same. It's a huge waste of money if all you're doing is gaming. Now, keep in mind that the theme of this is to see if Eco Mode impacts anything and to find those changes and how negatively your performance gets hit. So all you're really looking for here is if Eco Mode results are close to stock, then it's in good shape. If you see it better, in most instances, that's because it's within error. So if you see a difference of 1 FPS and Eco Mode's technically better, it's error. We'll start with the gaming benchmarks for GTA 5, which gives us some scaling between Eco Mode and stock on the 7950. Stock settings have the 7950X at 177 FPS average with a 2.7% lead over the 65 watt Eco Mode. As a reminder, GTA 5 has an engine limit at about 187.5 FPS average, so we're close enough to that cap that some of the frame rate is getting shaved off by engine limitations, not by the CPU or the GPU. 105 watt mode is within variance of stock performance, which is going to be the theme for the rest of the gaming section. For a cross-brand comparison, the Intel i9 13900K is 5% ahead of the 105 watt 7950X. Moving to CSGO at 1080p, the scaling is more limited. Stock is tied with the 105 watt 7950X and just barely 2% ahead of the 65 watt 7950X, so effectively meaningless. That also goes for the differences, or the lack thereof, between the 7950X in any mode and the 7900X or 7700X. The most interesting takeaway is that the 7950X is able to outperform the 76X by about 10% with the same 142 watt PBT, despite having to feed 10 more cores. The lead over the 13600K is 15% for 105 watt mode and 12% for 65 watt mode, but again, the 136K is far cheaper. So for a more fair comparison, but it's still cheaper, the 13900K is functionally tied. 1440p is a little bit shuffled, but not in a way that matters. The 7950X at stock and Eco, it's now falling within variance of its own dataset. In Far Cry 6, the 7950X again performed within error of itself in all modes. That's a good thing for Eco Mode, but it means that positioning versus other CPUs is virtually unaffected. The 13900K at 196 FPS average leads the 105 watt 7950X by 14%. Which ran at 172 and ties with the 7900X. That clearly reinforces the bad value for the 7950X in gaming-only builds. Final Fantasy XIV, Intel blew past everyone and held a significant lead with the 13900K at 35% ahead of all 7950 results. Similarly, if you look at the 7950X results, they're all within error. So before anyone goes shouting to the hills about how Eco Mode is better than stock or something, that's not what you're seeing here. This is just run-to-run variants, and they're all the same. The rest of the games in our test suite, like Shadow of the Tomb Raider, Rainbow Six, Total Warhammer 3, for example, show the same story as Far Cry 6. They're within error at stock average FPS, we'll rotate through the results, but they're the same. Games typically aren't concurrently threaded enough to get the CPU in a state where it needs to leverage many cores at once, and it's hitting that power limit as much. You could probably engineer an extreme scenario where you would see more of a difference, like spawning hundreds of physics objects in a small environment, but standard gaming on the 7950X is barely affected by the existing Eco Mode presets. Now, a couple important notes here if you plan to use this on your own system. When the motherboards first shipped, the early BIOSes did not have Eco Mode in them. Now, PBO means you could just go in and manually tune the values to whatever you want. That's your own Eco Mode. It's a bespoke Eco Mode. It's custom and handmade. Except in this case, it is a lot easier to just apply the settings that they've given you, and those will match our results here. So you can update BIOS for that if you haven't, and if you don't see Eco Mode in your settings. Now, for our work, we used 0705 BIOS version on the Asus motherboard that we test with, X670E board we use. We retested to see if there were any major changes, and there weren't, other than occasionally we saw a 25 megahertz improvement on the 7950X when stock. Not enough to really impact the results versus our review. You're in really like less than 1% differences in most cases. So this is something that'll make a small difference. It slightly affects the relationship between other CPUs on the chart that are Ryzen CPUs, but not in a major way. And for you should just get the latest BIOS to get Eco Mode. So concluding them, some important power numbers here. All core is obviously the one that's impacted the most. Single core workloads, not really a change at all. And that's because you're not bound by power there anyway, so you're not really limiting much. For multi-threaded workloads that aren't non-stop all-core like Blender is, the difference is less than you'll see in a production application like Chromium or Blender. So in gaming, yeah, it might be all-core sometimes, but it's not running at 100% all the time. You get that spiky behavior where maybe it hits the GPU for a bit, maybe it backs off because there's some other bottleneck, maybe there's an engine limit like you see in GTA 5, whatever. So just as a recap of the power numbers we showed earlier, it's 263 watts stock when under an all-core load. It's 158 with 105 watt Eco Mode, so that's where you see that TDP does not equal power consumption. And then it's 89 watts at 65 watts Eco Mode. Frequencies, we saw a 305 megahertz drop at 105 watt Eco Mode, so it's from 5103 down. And then we saw a 1045 megahertz drop at 65 watts Eco Mode. For efficiency, we did see that 36% increase in efficiency for 105 watt Eco Mode versus stock. It is at the cost of more time to render, of course, and then 55% more efficiency at 65 watts, but you're starting to cut off enough performance where it's questionable whether this is the right CPU to buy anyway. In games, we didn't see huge differences, and then in production applications, you're approaching double digits in some situations, but 65 watts. In production applications, again, just speaking as production users, so a little bit of opinion mixed in here from our own use cases subjectively. 65 watt Eco Mode is not something we would use because you're cutting enough the performance off that in a business environment or any kind of freelance environment where you use the CPU to make money, it just feels kind of bad to spend extra 150 bucks and then torpedo the performance for whatever, 10%, 13% for the sake of efficiency when you're kind of losing time efficiency and therefore maybe the reason you bought it to begin with. A 105 watt Eco Mode is actually really interesting though, and you should be considering that one. So that's it for this one. Thanks for your patience as we work back through all the follow-ups we've wanted to do for like a month or two now. Really interesting results, 105 for sure, 65 less interesting to us, although hanging on and gaming, not too bad. So thanks for watching, subscribe for more as always. Go to store.gamersaccess.net to grab one of our mod mats, our coaster packs, or our other items to help us directly, or patreon.com/gamersnexus, where that money is used directly to help fund our testing procedures and the time we spend on all of this. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.